Welcome to the Diversity Lecture Conversations. My name is Dillon Carr. I'm a professor of anthropology here at Grand Rapids Community College. And my guest today is Ethan Waters. He's an author and a journalist who is going to be giving the Diversity Lecture talk tonight on his most recent work, his book titled Crazy Like Us, The Globalization of the American Psyche. So welcome, Ethan.
Thank you.
Welcome to Grand Rapids.
Thank you so much.
First time, but, for a little background information, in case you're not aware of his work, Crazy Like Us, it was on my summer reading list, so that was kind of like a treat in here, and it really kind of looks at aspects of the way in which the American ideas of the psyche and mental illness, really Western ideas about that, how they sort of become exported into these cross-cultural contexts in here, and really the conflict that sort of emerges when you encounter non-Western ideas of mental illness and mental health. And really the thing that kind of struck me reading the book, you have these 4 different cases that you kind of focus on, was really just a tremendous breadth to which sort of that phenomenon is occurring, and the different contexts and really the different mechanisms in which that process is happening in there. So I was wondering, in terms of when you're putting the book together, researching it, did any one of those 4 situations kind of surprise you the most, or what kind of jumped out at you as?
So I began, the idea for the book came when I was up at McGill University talking to a medical anthropologist up there, and he was talking about how he was invited out by GlaxoSmithKline in 2001 when they were talking about getting Paxil into that culture, and not only getting Paxil into that culture, but fundamentally changing the way Japan thought about depression and sadness states. And he told me this remarkable story, and I realized that clearly is one vector for how the West changes other cultures. We manufacture most of the drugs, and then in selling them to other cultures, we not only often sell the drug, but we sell the idea of what the illness is, particularly when it comes to mental illnesses. That vector probably would surprise no one. Like the idea that a drug company would want to do that, would want to take a best-selling drug like Paxil, take it to another culture. So I thought that was an important story to tell. It was one of the fundamental 4 stories of the book, but I also wanted to see other vectors. What other ways were these cultural ideas getting across cultures? Because there's many of them. So I looked to things like how celebrity influences ideas, conceptions of mental illnesses in different places, and how that goes across cultures. Our medical interventions, such as when we had the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, we went over there with lots of trauma counselors. And so our ideas of PTSD were sort of born on that wave of people that went over there. So I was literally, like, just as you say, I was looking for like different and surprising vectors. And the most surprising one, I think probably the most interesting one for me was the PTSD and the trauma counseling abroad. We do it with such, it's such a wonderful thing that we try to do when we see, suffering in other cultures. But I think once you understand, when we go over there with just a week notice or 10 days notice, and we don't understand the language, we don't understand the culture, the modes of grieving, the ways that they, in that particular culture, understand suffering after trauma, I think you begin to see it as a little problematic. One researcher asked me to sort of imagine it in reverse, and he said, imagine after 9/11 if shaman from Mozambique came over and began knocking on doors of the survivors of the 9/11 tragedy and said, I need to lead you through these certain rituals so that you could release the spirit of your dead. And, how would that sound to us? Would that make any sense at all? And of course it wouldn't, but it seems to me we do pretty much the similar thing in reverse. And I think we do it because we think what we have to offer is science. We think that PTSD is a sort of a newly discovered disease, that we know about it more than other people, and we need to inform the rest of the world about it. And I think, once you begin to understand that cultures around the world, cultural meaning after a bad event matters, and it matters to the symptoms, but it matters also to the modes of healing you look for. And once you understand that, I think the sort of interventions we have abroad become quite problematic.
It's good, and it kind of dovetails into kind of my next question is, as an anthropologist reading the book, one of I think the key themes that I kind of drew from it was really a pretty sharp critique of that biomedical paradigm. The idea then that
Right.
if it's got a strong scientific basis to it, it's got to be sort of objectively truthful,
Right.
regardless of the cultural context in which you impose that in. There. And so sort of around this talk, one of the questions I've kind of posed for my students to kind of think about is really thinking about this relationship between culture and biology, particularly in terms of how it, say, affects human behavior, in terms of how much of our behavior will be sort of culturally conditioned, how much it becomes sort of really something that's situated almost entirely in terms of a cultural context. And really kind of frame that with, it's not that hard to kind of pick up the science section of the newspaper or something to hear scientists discover the gene that controls and kind of fill in the blank
Right.
in there. I was wondering if you could kind of maybe share your thoughts
Right.
on what you think that relationship is, and maybe since you do a lot of writing in this kind of sort of topical space, is how much of your thoughts on that have changed over your kind of career.
Right. I mean, certainly there's no culture that's more advanced in terms of understanding the biomedical underpinnings of diseases, and and we're getting better at the understanding of the biomechanics of the brain. It's remarkable to think that it was in 1970 that lithium came out, and it was in terms of a drug that could prove that the brain was influenced by chemicals, or that mental illnesses could be influenced by chemicals. It was just a remarkable drug. It was actually fairly effective for manic depression in other states. But since 1970, the drugs affecting mental illness has been a very problematic road. It has not been the march of progress everyone had hoped it would be. That said, whatever we know about that and whatever advances we have in our culture, I do think we have an obligation to share them. So I don't think it's, and even with that example of depression in Japan and the introduction of Paxil, I think there were many things that are problematic about that, but there is some suggestion that after the introduction of Paxil, and which was followed very closely by Prozac and some other SSRIs, that suicide rates have leveled off in Japan. So it's not necessarily like we're the bad guys imposing other cultures. In fact, what often happens is that other cultures are really reaching out to us for this. Like they believe we have the technology and are advanced in these areas, and they very much want to adopt it. So I've talked to people that have gone abroad, like doctors and researchers, with the sincere hope that they were going to learn from another culture, that they were going to take the back seat. And in many instances, you go to another culture and you literally get handed the microphone and put on the stage, and they ask you, what do you know that we need to know about the mind and drugs and so forth? So it's not a matter of us sort of imposing our will on other cultures. Oftentimes it's a matter of them wanting that very same thing. So I think it's sort of on us to understand the limitations of these drugs and to be very clear about them, not only with other cultures, but with our own culture as well. So there's deep problems with SSRIs and suicidality, and many other medical drugs drugs for mental illness have huge side effects and are deeply problematic. And we need to be clear about that within our own culture, and perhaps that will help us when we go to other cultures and introduce these ideas. Yeah.
Do you see this kind of working in I guess, reverse sometimes too? Obviously, the examples you have, other than maybe the GlaxoSmithKline example, where everything else really was good-natured, sort of desire to legitimately help in context. But do you ever see sort of any examples or hear suggestions about sort of the opposite way in terms of sort of traditional of medical knowledge or systems coming back to the United States and providing sort of a similar exchange, that if they're desiring for our essentially scientific or biomedical sort of information, are there ways that maybe we can inform our own understanding?
Absolutely. And you see this not many times in specific interventions with specific mental illnesses, but like movements like mindfulness, which is becoming very much the word of the day, clearly comes from sort of Eastern traditions of like how to think about meditation and mindfulness. And I think, but I think if there's one thing other cultures have to share with us, I think in the West we have this pretty clearly this sort of egocentric notion of the self. We think of the self as within our own brain, like we are in charge of ourselves and we make the decisions in the world, we move through the world as individuals. And in other cultures, the self really belongs as part of the group. You are more your place in the group than you are the individual. And I think in some ways that's what the rest of the world has to teach us about the human self, because I think they're fundamentally right. I think the idea that we are this individuated self, that we don't think like our culture thinks, or we get to choose how we think, even in the culture, I think it's fundamentally incorrect. I think we are actually, even as we think of ourselves as individuals, our culture is the water we swim in, and we can't not, think like our culture thinks. Yeah. And I think there's some interesting research that's just coming out that suggests that's true in other cultures and these sociocentric notions of the self, but it's also true in America. So I'm hoping that new research that comes out will begin to sort of influence and inform the discussion about how we think about the self in America. And I think it's high time that we sort of learn the lesson.
Yeah, I think your example in the book with sort of the way in which schizophrenics sort of experience sort of better outcomes in some way in developing countries, I think is probably a great example of that.
That was really a remarkable result. This was a World Health Organization study that went over several decades that charted the outcomes with people that had experienced psychotic breaks to see how they did. Not only how they did with their illness, but whether they got married, whether they had a job, whether they stayed with their families, whether they were institutionalized, on and on and on, outcome after outcome, and compared them with people in developed countries. And what it found, to pretty much everyone's surprise, I think, is that people in developing countries often did much better on all those outcomes. And that should lead us, like that alone, that result alone should set us back a little bit and say, okay, if the outcomes are better in these other places, like what are they doing that's different? And what are we doing that might be worse? And to really look at that. And I think there's a lot of research around how in other cultures there's lower levels of what's called expressed emotion around these diseases. And I think it goes back to our notion of the egocentric self, the idea that we become unstuck through a psychotic break, that we become utterly permeable to ideas and notions that exist around us, that we can't keep ourself together. That is an idea that challenges the American sense of self deeply. Other cultures, say in Zanzibar, where I traveled to talk with this anthropologist about this exact phenomenon, the notion that spirits might possess you is a pretty common one. That so everyone is to degrees possessed by spirits at different times. Maybe they get angry, maybe they lose their cool, they're momentarily possessed by jinns or genies. So in that cultural context, the person that has the psychotic break is sort of normalized in a way. They are like us, only more so in some ways. So they are allowed to they can stay within this sort of family unit, stay within this sort of narrative about the culture. There's a place for them. And that tends to be hugely helpful over time. And unlike in the United States, when someone has a psychotic break here, very unusual that they can then function in any way within that family unit or within a job or within a community setting. They suddenly become the other. So when you look at these narratives across cultures about where the line is between pathology and normalness, I think the fundamental line is like, does that narrative put them outside of the group, or does it keep them inside the group? And even with things like schizophrenia, you can have narratives that keep the individual within the group, as opposed to sort of allowing you to see them as the ill other.
Yeah, and sort of you talked to a lot of mental health practitioners, and that becomes one of the key issues with it, is that stigmatization of sort of mental illnesses. And if you're in a context where that stigma doesn't necessarily get applied to the individual, but it's viewed as more external factors like spirit possession, then you really allow them to stay connected to the social group.
In some ways, it takes the guilt and the shame that an individual or a family might take on themselves, and allows them to put it on this sort of social narrative that we all agree on. This happens to everyone. It's just happening a little more to this family member, and it allows sort of space for them to. For both the family and the individual to keep that lower level of expressed emotion around the illness, less concern.
Several of your books, Crazy Like Us, obviously one, but then you're probably most well known for like Making Monsters, and some of your writing on the recovery memory movement in here. So I remember kind of reading that, and it's kind of or reading Crazy Like Us, and then sort of looking at your bio, and like, this guy really has a lot of sort of critique of common social psychology and psychiatry practice. And then I was reading like towards the end of Crazy Like Us, and you mentioned you're actually married to a psychiatrist.
Yes.
Does your wife know you're making these books?
Yes. She really, the first couple books, Making Monsters, it's worth mentioning because it is where I started this whole thing. So this was the recovered memory movement in the early 90s, where women by the thousands were going into the psychotherapy settings and coming out with these believed memories of child abuse, but also like satanic cult stories. Very often then displaying these remarkable symptoms of multiple personality disorder, which is now called dissociative identity disorder. And it was clear to me in writing that book that we critiqued that movement, those ideas that led to those beliefs and behaviors, saw them to be culturally based, saw them to be utterly iatrogenic, created in the therapeutic setting. But it did leave me with this question with MPD. When you see these people switching between personalities, a very florid, dramatic symptoms, right? It left me with the question, to what extent are other mental illnesses in some ways also shaped by the cultural expectations? And it took me years of thinking about that and years of thinking about, well, how do you know whether that was happening? And really the two answers are you either look across cultures or you look across time, and you see how these change in different cultures or change across time. So those books really did lead me to to where I am today, intellectually. And I did marry a psychiatrist, which people did think was funny because those first couple books were very critical of fundamental premises that were being within psychiatry. But there were a lot of people within those professions, my wife among them, that was horrified by the mistakes that were being made at the time. And this last book, I have to say, of Crazy Like Us, all the heroes are the cross-cultural psychiatrists who are learning these things. And there are people in the profession that would still like to think of the human mind as being the same around the world, and this assumption that if mental illnesses are not the same around the world, then other cultures need to catch up with our understanding of them. And you do find that, but I think that the smartest people in the field, and that's been largely the reaction to the book, the field of psychiatry has been remarkably receptive to it, with this idea that this is something new we're learning, that culture is deeply impactful on how our symptoms come about, because they are languages of suffering that we learn to express, and those languages change from time to time. They've been very, very receptive. So my wife is very proud of the last book and doesn't think of it as a critique of her profession, I think.
Do you or did you intend these kind of books to be a critique of psychiatry, or do you see them in conversation with the discipline? Or how,
the first one, Making Monsters, was definitely the idea was seeing a unique wrong happening, and the idea was like, my co-author Richard Offshin and I were going to document what was happening, and in doing so, we were going to lock some very bad people inside the building and just burn it down. It was a very, it was an aggressive book about something we thought was that was bad, that was happening to patients and families. We did learn, when you attack a belief system that is very much already barred from any criticism, like that was one of these belief systems where you just could not second guess it in any way, or you were out of the group. Whether people listen to you, I think we changed the cultures in general. That book and a couple other books and some good pieces of journalism changed the way people thought about that controversy. But whether it changed minds within the field, the people that really believe that there were satanic cults everywhere killing babies, and to have that sort of belief requires that you turn off the rest of the world a little bit. So it's but in general, I think my interest, sort of more broadly speaking, is how does culture influence cognition, right? So you could see that across like pretty much everything I've written, like with the fundamental outcome of, I believe that the human mind is, does not as much think for itself as mimics culture. Like that is literally the great thing about the human mind, is not that it's the best problem solver, that's the biggest, thinker. It's that we mimic culture, and culture carries information within it, and that's what the human mind does, fundamentally. And that's and that's sort of finding that and ways of writing about that in different areas is really what I'm excited about.
Okay. So you're kind of expanding on that core sort of theoretical sort of
Yeah.
focus in there, and you write or talk about aspects of like hysteria a lot, and I think that's probably a good sort of a disorder then I think that manifests that change across time and change across culture that you...
Absolutely. You can see, hysteria is a great one to point out because it is, you can look back at it, and the mental health profession, we're all very good at looking back and seeing in the rearview mirror, oh, culture was so impactful on that. So with hysteria, you see incorrect assumptions about the woman's anatomy, beliefs about women's inferiority, fear of female sexuality. You see all those currents sort of motivating and moving that disorder. It was remarkably popular. Tens of thousands of women. Clinicians, you would know it in a second when they saw it. It was these very florid symptoms again of sensitivity to touch, fainting, grotesque body movement, all these things. Couldn't be more clear at the time. And then it simply sort of drifts away. So that's and you can see examples across history, like, the rise of anorexia in certain times and places. They come and they go. And I think the problem I have is that the mental health profession, and in general, I think culturally speaking, for the rest of us, we can look back and see it in the rearview mirror and say, oh dear, those guys, those clinicians, those journalists, those patients, they were so influenced, poor people, they were so influenced by those cultural currents. And we seem incapable of learning the lesson, which is that those same influences are happening to all our diseases right now. Those same things are in play. Much more difficult to see it in real time than it is to see it, 10 years ago with the MPD, or 20 years ago with MPD, or 100 years ago with hysteria. So the trick is, let's not just see the mistakes of the last generation. Let's learn the lesson that is implicit in there, which is culture impacts symptomology. That's not going to be some sort of crazy cure to mental illness. The point is that if we understand that relationship, we will then suddenly have this magic cure. Undoubtedly won't be true, but we will understand these illnesses better, and we'll understand a little bit more about when the next sort of fad illness rises. We can sort of see it more clearly, I think.
I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit now. We have a lot of undecided students here at Grand Rapids Community College. And I always find that they really get excited kind of talking to people in terms of trying to figure out, how you got to where you are today, trying to figure out like a career direction or sort of a career arc. I wonder if you'd be able to kind of share a little bit, how did you get into writing about these types of things in journalism and that? Was that something you always set out to do, or is this kind of just fell into your lap?
It's an interesting question, and for me it was made more problematic by the fact that I'm moderately dyslexic. Mm-hmm. So writing for me as a kid and reading was always extremely difficult. I was always very much behind other people. And I got around it in a number of ways. One, I think when I began to get around it was when I realized that writing is difficult for everyone, regardless of whether you're dyslexic or not. It's super difficult to do. And it's not worth doing if you're simply sort of communicating the ideas you already have. What writing does is allow you to learn what you know about something in a new way. It allows you to find ideas, not simply communicate them. Mm-hmm. And if you think of it in that way, it's worth the pain of doing. Mm-hmm. I'm going to really discover what I know about this through the process of writing. So I'm always, whatever career path people are on, I'm always encouraging people to make writing part of that career path, because good writing is good thinking in the same way, good math is good statistics. It is really connected to how we think.
See, I'm going to play this every time my student asks about a writing assignment I gave them. So.
Right. And you can tell them, I have an office in San Francisco. I started 20 years ago. We now have 33 offices, and about 55 writers use the space every month. And for every one of these, all full-time professional writers, and for every single one of them, the blank page is a trial, and the first draft is horrible for every single one of them. So just to know that, just because I think people, especially amateur writers or beginning writers, they see how hard it is and they think, well, I must not be good at this. This is so hard. It's just hard for everyone. And the joy of writing is rewriting and seeing your ideas synthesize and come out better on the next draft and the next draft and the next draft. And it can be, it can be at different points, especially in the second and third drafts, really joyful process. But the first draft, always difficult, but really worth doing. Yeah.
Good. I think we're getting pretty close to being up for time, so I just want to thank you for your willingness to come and have this conversation. And
it is my pleasure.
I'm looking forward to the talk tonight.
Yeah, me too.
So
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thank you.